Kindly use headphones for better experience. Story number 1, The Seventh Barn. There was a wealthy farmer who owned quite a bit of land in Ohio. Every time his wife had a baby, he would build a new barn and name the barn after the new baby. At one point, 6 babies had been born and 6 barns built. During childbirth of the 7th baby, his wife and the baby died in childbirth, leaving the farmer very depressed with one last barn to fill. He was so filled with grief that his farm went unattended and lost money. The rumor is that one night, in the depths of his madness and despair, the farmer grabbed an axe and led his children out to the barns, where he murdered them, one by one, in each of the barns named after them. He buried each body in the 6 barns that had been named after them. Then, the farmer went to the 7th barn, where he hung himself. As time went on, all of the barns were eventually torn down, and most of the land was sold off, all except for the 7th barn. Nobody wanted to buy the land because of what had happened on the tainted land. It soon fell into disrepair as it was abandoned with no upkeep. We've heard that if you go to that barn at night, you can see the ghost of the farmer hanging from the rafters, his body swinging back and forth in the wind, dwelling on his terrible crime for all eternity. No one was ever really sure where the 7th barn was located, although it was definitely in Ohio. Some said it was the Kranz farm in Cuyahoga Valley, and others said it was at Top of the World in Northampton. In 1997, a local Ohio teacher claimed that, after a lot of research, he had finally managed to track down the actual location of the infamous 7th barn. He said that none of the barns had ever actually been torn down. The land had just been divided up and sold off, and the barns had simply been incorporated into neighboring farms. According to the teacher, he was able to pinpoint the correct location because all of the barns on neighboring properties had nameplates above their doors with the names of children engraved on them. The teacher and his son set out at night to visit the barn, bringing a video camera with them in the hopes of capturing some paranormal activity. The next morning, the teacher's wife reported her husband and son missing. Police found their abandoned car by the roadside. While searching the area, they entered a barn in a nearby field and found the dead bodies of the teacher and his son hanging from the rafters. Story number 2, The Old Scarecrow. My friend Joe and I used to live next door to each other on our family farms back in Wisconsin. When I say next door, I really mean about 1 mile to 2 miles apart. It didn't matter how far apart our houses were, because the school bus would drop us off at either house because our parents said it was okay. His place was more of a cow dairy farm. We didn't have any cows, just land that my mom inherited after her gramps died. We let Joe's dad put his corn and clover hay crops on our land, and he would give us a steer every year to eat. It worked out well. One year, my friend and I were out back shooting old corn husks at birds with a slingshot. None of them could ever reach the birds, so we figured it was fun pretending. To our horror, one actually hit one of the crows who was coming closer to see what we were doing. We didn't know it would do that, and it is something I've regretted for a long time. Dad always taught me that there should be a reason to kill an animal if we needed food or clothing, so I felt really bad. We buried it in the backyard. I told him about the crow, and I got my butt whooped something big. The next day, there were crows all over the corn crops tearing at our new harvest, but when we went outside, they would all fly away and come back when we went back inside. Dad told me I had to build a scarecrow so the birds would think a human was there and fly away. I grabbed some old overalls from Grandpa's closet, along with boots and a red and black wool checkered shirt. We stuffed the clothes with hay and built a big cross with 2 pieces of wood to hang him on. Mom was upset about the cross part because she thought it mocked Jesus, but Dad didn't think so. Before hanging the old guy up on the cross in the field, I stuffed a crow feather from the crow we accidentally killed. We must have missed it when we buried him, but the feather sat there as plain as day near its grave. The first day, the crows didn't come back, but that night, I swear, I heard something stomping around in the yard. When I looked outside, there was no one there, but I couldn't see the scarecrow due to the rain. The next day, with the sun shining, he was hanging there just fine. Then the next night, I heard the same thing. I looked out the window, and the scarecrow was gone. I ran outside yelling, "Dad, Dad!" But he didn't wake up. I didn't see the scarecrow anywhere. The next day, there he was, sitting on the cross again. I told Dad about it, and he just said it was probably a dream. The next night, around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps on the porch and knocking at the door. I wasn't about to answer it, but I heard Dad get up and the door open. Then there was a loud thud and nothing. Mom and I ran downstairs and had to call an ambulance for Dad, but he had died from a heart attack before the ambulance ever got there. The scarecrow was hanging there on the cross. Mom let Joe spend the night because we were all so sad and said I should have a friend over. She made us popcorn and bought movies, but I wasn't in the mood. We just sat in my room telling stories about our dads until it was time for bed. I had bunk beds, so Joe slept on the top bunk and I was on the bottom. That night, he heard the same stomping outside, and we both took off outside. Before us stood the scarecrow. Its face was no longer the old burlap sack we stuffed with hay. It was a human face with black feathers and beady black crow's eyes. Its mouth and nose were the black beak. We went running back inside the house, screaming. Mom told us we had to take apart the scarecrow the next day. We did, but sometimes at night, we still hear the stomping. Story number 3, what I heard in the barn. In the woods behind my house stood an old, worn-down barn. Most of the paint had chipped off, and the wood that held up the silo was rotted and busted, with holes everywhere. The people in town always used to say that the barn was haunted, but I never believed any of those old ghost stories. Me and my buddies talked about it a lot whenever we hung out, so after a few weeks of thought, I decided to check the place out, just out of curiosity. It was a rather damp Friday morning when I first set out for the old barn. Through the remnants of the previous night's thunderstorm, I trotted down the cleared dirt path leading to the old barn. The door wasn't locked, but it was still halted by a thicket of brambles and vines. So I walked around until I found a small opening in the side at about eye level. Apparently, someone tried to tear down the barn, but they didn't do a very good job, and I'm pretty sure they quit after the first 12 seconds. I shoved my hand through the opening, pulled a chunk off the board, and kicked, slammed against, and yanked on the old wood until I had enough of an opening for me to climb through. The inside of the barn was astounding. It was in pristine condition, despite being here for at least 100 years. Old horse-drawn machinery stood rusted on the dirt floor. A tractor stood solemnly in the back of the barn, rusted and rendered silent by the tides of time. Hay bales stood stacked up in an almost perfect staircase, some of it still golden, untouched by the wind and weather. It was a sight to see. So for the next week, I brought all of my friends to see it, and we talked about it for weeks. One Thursday, my friend Max approached me in the hallway, in between periods. "Mark," he started, "that barn's been there for 100-something years. Have you ever entertained the thought that it just might be haunted? Just once?" "It's not haunted," I told him. "And if you're wrong, then what?" he demanded. "It's not haunted. For crying out loud, Max, the barn's not frickin' haunted." I silently scolded him. He gave me a "yeah, right look," and walked away. But he had me thinking. I asked around that night. According to the old folks in the town, if you sat in the barn in the midnight hour, you could hear everything that took place in that barn. The next night, I set out with nothing but what I could fit in a pack and made the trek down at about 11:30 that night. I stepped into the barn, made myself a little fire to give me some warmth and sight, and settled in. At about midnight, I woke up after dozing off to hear the sound of giggling and footsteps. I did a double take, looking for the door to open, but it stayed shut. But I could hear footsteps rustling atop the hay pile. I just stayed in my chair, hoping to catch what was said. But all I heard was the faint sounds of giggling and the echoes of kissing lovers. I sat there in the darkness for almost a half hour until I heard another sound. It was a gun being chambered. I heard a young man's voice beg for mercy. "No, no, 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 no," he cried. His girlfriend pleaded with what I gathered to be her father. "Daddy, no," she pleaded. Suddenly, I heard a gunshot go off. I covered my head with my hands in fear. I heard a faint, feminine squeal. Then another gunshot went off. There was a rustling, then a loud slam, like something had fallen on wood. The last sound I heard was the fading footsteps of a man running away from what he had done. My mind was racing as I dozed off again. I woke up abruptly to the muffled sounds of an angry crowd. They grew louder and louder. I heard the sounds of heavy breathing and the crowd getting louder and louder. I couldn't quite hear everything, but I heard what I assumed to be the father's voice defending himself, calling the mob a bunch of crazy SOBs, cursing the boy, blaming his daughter's death on the boy. But the crowd only got louder. I heard the father scream, "Get your hands off me," he cried. But the crowd only got louder. "What are you doing? What the hell are you doing? No!" The man's cries stopped. I heard a pounding against the wall of the barn, but the voices remained silent. Then the footsteps faded away. All I could hear was a strange, almost inaudible sound now and then, but after a while, it stopped. I crept up to the door, opening up a crack just big enough for me to see through. Nothing. I bent down and pulled at the vines under the door until I could get enough free to open up the door. I heard nothing except for the chirping of crickets and the single hoot of an owl. I saw something on the ground. I picked it up. It was an old, tattered piece of a leather vest. As I stood up, I noticed something move out of my peripherals. I turned. In front of me, at the end of an old, rotted rope, was a single, perfectly tied hanging noose. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that you won't miss more spooky stories. Good night. I love you.